Growing up with strict parents in the 70s and 80s often meant that your childhood felt very different from what you see today. For many kids, rules were not just guidelines, they were absolute. There was very little room for negotiation, and when your parents laid down the law, you knew better than to challenge it. One of the first things you learned was that the thermostat wasn't yours to touch. If the house was cold, you put on another sweater. If it was hot, you were told to open a window. But actually turning that dial was considered an offense. And if you even looked at it too long, you'd get a sharp warning. Curfews were another hallmark of strict parenting. If your parents said you had to be home by 9 p.m., you didn't dare walk through the door at 9:05. Being late by even a few minutes could mean losing privileges for a week, or being grounded until further notice. It didn't matter if your ride was late or if you had the best excuse in the world. Strict parents saw rules as rules, and excuses didn't count. The dinner table also reflected that seriousness. Meals were not a time for arguing or complaining about food. If you didn't like what was served, you kept quiet, because the phrase, "You'll eat what's on your plate or you'll go hungry," was practically a family motto. Many children of strict households can still remember eating vegetables they hated, silently chewing, while their parents watched to make sure they finished every bite. Even small freedoms were carefully controlled. The phone, for example, came with strict time limits. Long-distance calls were expensive, and parents didn't want to see the bill spike because their child was talking too long. A 5-minute call to a friend was considered generous, and if you went over, you could count on hearing about it. Life under strict parents was a constant reminder that children weren't in charge. It was a world where rules shaped almost every moment, and stepping out of line came with consequences you didn't soon forget. For kids with strict parents, the home itself was filled with invisible lines you weren't supposed to cross. Every room had its rules, and every rule had consequences. It didn't matter how small the situation seemed. The boundaries were clear, and they weren't open for debate. Television time was a perfect example. Parents decided what you were allowed to watch, and usually, it wasn't what you wanted. Saturday mornings might start with cartoons, but if your parents thought you'd been watching too long, the TV would suddenly switch off with no discussion. Certain shows were outright banned, either because they were considered too violent, too silly, or simply a waste of time. And if you dared to argue, you'd hear the classic line, "Not under my roof." Chores were another non-negotiable part of life. While other kids might have been outside playing, you were inside sweeping the floors, vacuuming the carpets, or helping with dishes. Saturday mornings especially were reserved for cleaning. Beds had to be made with precision, laundry folded just right, and no corner of the house was to be overlooked. The idea was simple. Fun came only after work was done. Clothing was also tightly controlled. Strict parents didn't care what was fashionable or what other kids at school were wearing. If they bought it, you wore it. Hand-me-downs from cousins, shirts with collars too stiff, or pants that rode just a little too high. None of it mattered. Complaining about your wardrobe was seen as ungrateful, and the more you resisted, the more likely you were to be told, "You'll wear it because I bought it." Even small personal choices often weren't yours to make. Music, for example, had to pass parental approval. Rock records with flashy covers might be confiscated, and tapes with questionable lyrics sometimes disappeared altogether. Kids who wanted to listen had to hide their music under the bed or wait until their parents were gone. In homes with strict rules, individuality often took a back seat. The house was run with order and discipline, and children were expected to follow along without question. For kids raised by strict parents in the 70s and 80s, school was never just about learning. It was about performance, respect, and carrying the family's expectations on your shoulders. Education wasn't treated as optional. It was serious business, and your parents made sure you understood that every single day. Bringing home a report card was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences. An A might earn a nod of approval, but a B was considered slipping. Anything below that was unacceptable. Some kids remember hiding their report cards in their backpacks, dreading the moment their parents would see. And if the teacher ever called home to report bad behavior, you knew that the punishment at school would be nothing compared to what was waiting when you got home. Homework wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. You were expected to sit down right after school, finish every assignment, and then double-check your work. Falling asleep over a math book wasn't uncommon because the rules were clear. No TV, no friends, no phone calls until the homework was done to your parents' satisfaction. Discipline was swift and certain. Strict parents didn't believe in timeouts or long negotiations. Instead, rules were enforced immediately and firmly. Talking back, even in the smallest way, was one of the fastest routes to punishment. A sigh, an eye roll, or a muttered comment under your breath could be enough to land you in serious trouble. Even outside of academics, school life came with expectations. You were told to respect teachers without question. If you got into an argument with a teacher, it didn't matter what your side of the story was. Your parents automatically sided with the adult. Authority figures carried weight, and challenging them was never an option. For kids growing up under this kind of parenting, school felt less like a place to explore and more like an extension of the rules at home. The pressure to perform was constant, and the consequences of failure, whether academic or behavioral, were always close behind. Having strict parents in the 70s and 80s didn't just shape life at home or in school. It shaped your entire social world. Friendships, outings, and even small freedoms were all filtered through layers of rules and parental control. Curfews were one of the most defining restrictions. If your parents said 9 o'clock, then 9 o'clock wasn't a suggestion. It was the law. Kids learned quickly that 5 more minutes wasn't something you asked for, because returning even a little late meant losing privileges or being grounded for days. The fear of seeing your parents waiting at the door, checking their watch, was enough to keep you running home before the clock struck. Parties and sleepovers were another challenge. Strict parents often didn't allow them at all. If you were lucky enough to attend, the rules were long. No music they disapproved of, no wandering outside, and certainly no calling boys or girls on the phone late at night. Many kids grew up envying their friends with cool parents who seemed to allow everything. But even if you argued that everyone else is going, the answer was still the same. You're not everyone else. Dating was often the strictest area of all. In many homes, it was simply off limits until you were considered old enough, though that age was never clearly defined. Some kids had to resort to secret notes, quick phone calls, or stolen moments at school just to experience the beginnings of teenage romance. And if your parents ever caught wind of it, the punishment was swift and the embarrassment unforgettable. Even hanging out with friends after school could be complicated. Some parents required detailed explanations: who you were with, where you were going, how long you'd be there, and sometimes even a phone call to the other child's parents. The idea of just hanging out didn't exist. Every activity had to be approved, monitored, and accounted for. For strict households, the social world wasn't about freedom. It was about control. Kids learned to navigate friendships carefully, always balancing their own desires against the rules waiting for them back home. When you grew up with strict parents in the 70s and 80s, even entertainment wasn't entirely your own. Every leisure activity came with limits, and often those limits made you feel like you were living in a different world from your friends. Television, for example, was rationed like a precious commodity. You might get an hour or two in the evening, but never without supervision. Cartoons, variety shows, and family sitcoms were usually allowed, but anything considered too silly or too adult was strictly forbidden. MTV, when it arrived in the early 80s, was a battleground in many homes. If your parents thought the music videos were inappropriate, you weren't allowed to watch, no matter how popular it was, with your classmates. Trips to the movies were rare and often treated like a luxury. Even then, your parents decided what was appropriate. Rated PG might be okay, but PG-13 or R? Absolutely not. Many kids ended up hearing about blockbuster movies from their friends long before they were ever allowed to see them themselves. And if your parents did take you, they often sat beside you like watchdogs, ready to cover your eyes at the first sign of something they didn't approve of. Music was another area of tight control. Owning a record collection was tricky if your parents inspected the covers or read the lyrics. Albums with flashy artwork or suggestive themes were often confiscated or never allowed into the house in the first place. Some kids got creative, taping songs off the radio, hiding cassettes in shoeboxes, or borrowing records from friends just to hear the music they weren't supposed to. Even free time outside was monitored. Riding bikes, playing ball, or hanging out at the park usually came with time limits and constant reminders to stay where I can see you. While other kids roamed the neighborhood until the streetlights came on, strict parents made sure you checked in regularly. Or better yet, stayed close to home. For children of strict households, fun was never completely free. Entertainment was something you enjoyed carefully, always aware of the invisible boundary lines set by your parents. Growing up with strict parents in the 70s and 80s left marks that went far beyond childhood. At the time, many kids felt weighed down by the endless rules, the constant discipline, and the sense of never quite measuring up. But looking back now, decades later, it's impossible to deny the lasting impact those years had on shaping character, values, and resilience. One of the strongest lessons was responsibility. Children of strict parents learned early that actions had consequences. If you broke a rule, you faced a punishment. If you made a mistake, you were expected to own it. That sense of accountability may have felt harsh back then, but in adulthood, it often translated into reliability, strong work ethic, and the ability to push through challenges. Respect for authority was another deeply ingrained value. Whether it was teachers, elders, or bosses later in life, kids raised under strict households grew up understanding the importance of order and structure. While this sometimes made them overly cautious, it also gave them a foundation of discipline that carried into careers and personal relationships. Of course, not all lessons were positive. Many remember struggling with self-expression, carrying an inner critic that mirrored the voices of their parents. For some, independence was harder to embrace because so much of childhood had been controlled and monitored. Yet even those struggles shaped a generation that valued perseverance and found creative ways to carve out their identities. Looking back, what felt suffocating at the time is often softened by nostalgia. People remember the stern warnings, the curfews, the rules about school and chores, but they also remember the underlying reason. Their parents wanted them to succeed, to stay safe, and to grow up with a sense of direction in a rapidly changing world. In the end, growing up with strict parents in the 70s and 80s wasn't easy, but for many, it created a foundation that still influences the way they raise their own children, blending lessons of discipline with a touch more freedom than they were ever allowed.